There are moments in life that arrive without warning, moments that slip through the cracks of your carefully constructed walls and reach the part of you that you had sworn to keep locked forever. For Marcus Vell, that moment came on a Tuesday afternoon in a glass-walled conference room 30 floors above the city, when a woman in a pale yellow dress walked into his world and quietly destroyed every plan he had ever made for himself. He had not expected to feel anything that day. That was the truth of it. The honest and somewhat embarrassing truth. Marcus had stopped expecting to feel things a long time ago. He was 34 years old, the founder of a mid-size investment consultancy that had grown faster than anyone in his industry had predicted, and he had built his life with the same cold precision he brought to every financial projection. His days were structured. His evenings were managed. His relationships, such as they were, fit neatly into the boundaries he had drawn around himself like a fortress. He was not unkind. He was not cruel. He was simply someone who had decided, after a particular kind of heartbreak years ago, that closeness was a liability he could no longer afford. And then, she walked in. Her name was Serena Calvo. She was a legal consultant brought in by one of his firm's largest clients to review a contract dispute that had been dragging on for months. She came with a leather portfolio under one arm and a composure so complete that it almost looked like armor, because it was. Marcus would not understand that for some time, but looking back, he would recognize that they had both arrived at that conference table carrying the same invisible weight, just dressed in different ways. She was taller than he had imagined from the brief description his assistant had given him. She wore her dark hair down, the kind of effortless wave that suggested she hadn't tried hard, but looked better than everyone who had. Her yellow dress was fitted and professional, stopping just past her knees, and she moved through the room with a quiet authority that made everyone at the table sit a little straighter without quite knowing why. Marcus stood when she entered, which surprised him, because he did not typically stand for anyone. The meeting lasted 2 hours. It was, in the language of business, productive. But something happened in those 2 hours that had nothing to do with the contract dispute. It happened in the small pauses, in the moments when Serena looked up from her notes, and her eyes met his across the conference table, and neither of them looked away quite quickly enough. It happened when she made a legal argument so precise and unexpected that Marcus felt something move in his chest, not attraction. Or not only attraction, but a kind of recognition. The strange feeling of seeing someone operating on the same frequency as yourself. When the meeting ended and the others filed out, Marcus found himself walking slower than usual. He told himself he had questions about the timeline. He told himself it was professional. But when he fell into step beside her in the corridor and said something about the case, she turned to look at him with those dark, steady eyes, and the professional excuse evaporated completely. They ended up in the lobby coffee area by a kind of mutual, unspoken agreement that neither of them acknowledged. They talked for 40 minutes about things that had nothing to do with contracts, about the city they both lived in, and somehow never seemed to stop long enough to appreciate, about the particular exhaustion of building something from nothing, about the strange loneliness that could live inside a successful life like a shadow that followed you into every well-lit room. She was funny in a dry, understated way that caught him off guard. She was honest in a manner that felt rare, the kind of honesty that comes not from carelessness but from having decided long ago that pretending was simply too much effort. When she finally stood to leave, adjusting the strap of her portfolio over her shoulder, Marcus asked her to dinner. He had not planned to. The words came out of some part of him that didn't consult the rest, and for a fraction of a second, something crossed her face, not surprise exactly, but a brief softening, like a window shade lifted and then quickly lowered again. She said yes. And then, almost in the same breath, she said something that he would carry with him for months like a stone in his pocket. She said, "I should tell you up front, I don't do complicated. I don't do ongoing. Whatever this is, it can only be one evening." He had smiled at that, and nodded, and said that he understood. And he did understand, in the intellectual sense. He had lived by a similar code himself for years. He understood perfectly well the kind of emotional arithmetic she was doing, the calculation that said connection is fine, as long as it remains contained, as long as it has a clear ending point, as long as you don't let it grow roots. He understood it because it was the same math he had been doing since the year he was 28, and had loved someone completely and then watched that love dissolve into something unrecognizable. So he understood. He just didn't believe it. Not about himself, and somewhere in the back of his mind, not entirely about her either. The restaurant he chose was quiet and warm, on a street that still had old brick buildings and trees that hadn't been cut back to make room for signage. He had been there twice before, both times alone, eating at the bar and reading something on his phone, which in retrospect said something he was only now beginning to admit about how he had been living. She arrived 7 minutes after him, wearing a different dress, still yellow, a coincidence that made him smile, and something about the fact that she had changed told him she had thought about the evening more than her composed voice had let on. They sat across from each other at a corner table with candles that were too short and a window that looked out onto the lit street. They ordered wine. They talked. And the talking was of the kind that is almost physically pleasurable, the kind where sentences finish each other's thoughts, where digressions lead somewhere better than the original path, where 2 hours feel like 20 minutes and 20 minutes feel like a conversation you have been waiting your entire life to have. Serena told him, in fragments and carefully, about the years she had spent building her legal practice. About the clients who had doubted her, the partners who had underestimated her, the particular burden of walking into rooms and knowing that you had to prove something before you were allowed to simply be. She talked about her family, a mother who had crossed oceans for a better life and never quite stopped moving, as though stillness might undo everything she had built. She talked about how she had learned from that mother to be self-sufficient, to need nothing from anyone, to treat every relationship as something that would eventually ask more of her than she had to give. Marcus listened to all of this with the attention of someone hearing their own story told in a different voice. Because his upbringing had given him different circumstances, but the same lesson that dependence was dangerous, that love was the thing most likely to derail a person from who they were trying to become. His father had been a brilliant and restless man who had loved his mother with an intensity that burned everything around it, including, eventually, himself. Marcus had watched that fire as a child and made a quiet, private vow that he would never let himself be consumed the same way. But sitting across from Serena, in that warm restaurant, with the candlelight doing what candlelight does to a face that was already more than worth looking at, Marcus felt the vow loosening. Not breaking, not yet, but loosening the way a knot does when it has been too tight for too long, and someone finally, gently, touches the right thread. When dessert was cleared and the wine was finished, and there was no reasonable excuse left to stay, they walked out into the cool night air together. The street was quiet. Their footsteps matched without trying, and when they stopped at the corner where they would logically go separate ways, she turned to him. And he could see in her expression something that she was managing very carefully, a warmth she was keeping at arm's length, an openness she was keeping on a very short leash. She said it then, clearly, and without cruelty. "This was wonderful, I mean that. But this is just one night. That was the agreement." She said it the way a person recites something they have rehearsed, not because they don't mean it, but because they need the rehearsal to mean it convincingly enough. And Marcus looked at her for a long moment, this woman in her yellow dress on a quiet city street, this brilliant and guarded and quietly aching person, and he said something that surprised them both. He said, "I understand what you're saying, but I have to be honest with you. I want every night, not just this one." She stared at him, not with anger and not with fear exactly, but with the particular expression of someone who has built a careful structure and just heard something that could bring it down. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said goodnight, turned, and walked away. He watched her go. And instead of the relief he would have expected to feel, the familiar comfort of a clean ending, a closed door. No complications, he felt the opposite. He felt something open. He told himself, in the days that followed, that he would leave it alone. He was a reasonable man. She had been clear. He had said his piece, which was arguably already more than he had intended. And now the dignified thing was to respect her boundary and move forward. He had work. He had responsibilities. He had a life that ran on schedules and projections and very little room for something as uncontrollable as wanting a specific person. But the mind, it turns out, is not always interested in what is reasonable. He found Serena Calvo in the most inconvenient places, in the particular quality of Tuesday afternoon light, in the sound of a dry laugh from across a crowded room, in every glass building he passed, that reflected the sky the way her eyes had reflected the candlelight. He thought about the things she had said over dinner, the sentences that had landed in him like seeds finding unexpectedly good soil. He thought about the way she had held her wine glass, loosely, as though she was practiced at holding things lightly. 3 weeks passed. He did not reach out. He had not saved her number, and he told himself this was a choice and not a regret. The contract dispute between his client and hers was eventually resolved, which meant there was no professional reason their paths would cross again. He accepted this with the kind of quiet discipline he had trained in himself for years. And then, on a Thursday morning that smelled like rain, he walked into his office building and stepped into the elevator, and she was already inside it. She was looking at her phone. She was wearing a dark blazer and carrying a coffee cup in one hand, and she looked like someone who had already been working for 3 hours. She glanced up when he stepped in, and the recognition moved across her face before she could stop it that brief, involuntary brightening that happens when you see someone you've been thinking about and haven't admitted you've been thinking about. They said hello. They asked each other the civilized questions. She explained she had a meeting on the 14th floor, a different client, a different matter. Nothing to do with him. He explained he was late, which was unusual. The elevator was slow, as elevators tend to be when you desperately need them to either speed up or stop entirely. And in the 30 seconds between the lobby and the 14th floor, something shifted, not dramatically, not with speeches or declarations. Just the way air pressure changes before a storm, a quiet, physical thing that the body knows before the mind catches up. When the doors opened at 14, she stepped out. And then she paused, and turned back, and looked at him with an expression he couldn't fully read, part resistance, part something softer. She said, "I still think I was right, about the one night." And he held the elevator door open with one hand and looked at her calmly, the way a person looks when they have stopped pretending not to want something. He said, "Then I'll keep disagreeing with you until you change your mind." She almost smiled. She covered it quickly. She walked away. He rode the remaining floors to his office with the feeling of a man who has bet on something and doesn't regret it even slightly. The weeks that followed were a kind of quiet negotiation that neither of them had formally agreed to begin. They ran into each other twice more, once at a legal and finance industry networking event that they had both apparently been attending for years without crossing paths, and once, improbably, at the same small bookshop on a Saturday morning. That second encounter undid something in both of them, because there is a difference between seeing someone in a professional context and seeing them in a Saturday morning context, standing at a bookshelf in a soft sweater, holding a novel they haven't decided about yet. It is the difference between knowing someone and recognizing them. They had coffee. They did not call it a date. They talked for 2 hours in a corner of the bookshop cafe, and somewhere in that conversation, Serena said something that Marcus had been waiting to hear without knowing he was waiting. She said that she was not afraid of him, specifically. She was afraid of what she recognized in him. She said that the dangerous relationships, in her experience, were not the ones with the wrong people. They were the ones with the right people, because the wrong people you could protect yourself from. The right people got past every wall you had without even trying. Marcus did not answer right away. He looked at her, at the careful way she was holding herself, at the honesty she was offering at the same time as she was trying to hold it back, and he felt something clarify in him. He had spent years building a life that was safe and solitary and good in every measurable way, and he had convinced himself that this was wisdom, maturity, the reasonable response to having been hurt. But sitting across from Serena in that bookshop, he understood, perhaps for the first time, that what he had built was not wisdom. It was a waiting room. A very comfortable, very well-furnished waiting room in which he had been sitting for 6 years, waiting for something he had also been refusing to let in. He said to her, quietly and without any drama, that he thought they were the same. That they had both been incredibly successful at building lives that left no room for the thing they most needed, and that he was tired of being successful at that. She looked at him for a long time. The coffee grew cold. The bookshop hummed around them. And she said nothing, but she did not look away, and he understood that this was its own kind of answer. If this story is already moving something in your heart, if you're feeling what Marcus is feeling in that bookshop, that terrifying and wonderful recognition, please keep reading. Part 2 is where everything either falls apart or finally begins. The first time Serena Calvo cried in front of Marcus Vell, she was not prepared for it. That was what she would tell herself afterward, in the weeks when she was still trying to understand how everything she had so carefully constructed had come undone so quickly and so completely. She had not been prepared. She had been ambushed by her own feelings in the worst possible way on an ordinary Wednesday evening, in his apartment, over something so small it was almost embarrassing. They had been spending time together for about 6 weeks by then. Not dating, she told herself. Not formally. They had never used that word. They met for coffee, for walks, for dinners that started as casual and ended as something she could not quite name. They talked on the phone late at night when they were both in the half-awake state that lowers all defenses, and those conversations wound into the early hours in the way that only conversations do when two people have stopped pretending they are not deeply interested in each other. She had maintained her position the whole time. She had told herself, and told him at regular intervals, that this was still bounded, still manageable, still something she could step back from at any moment with no damage done. She had believed this the way a person believes a flimsy thing they need to be true, not with conviction, but with the particular determined sincerity of someone who has no good alternative. But on that Wednesday, he had made dinner at his apartment for the first time. It was a simple dinner: pasta, good bread, a bottle of wine he had clearly thought about more than he was letting on. And at some point during the meal, he had leaned across the table to refill her glass, and he had said something about her laugh, something entirely ordinary and unguarded about how much he liked it, how it was the first thing he had noticed about her in that conference room even before she said a word. And something about the simplicity of it, the fact that he said it not as a romantic gesture but as a simple truth. The way you state something that needs no decoration broke through every defense she had. She didn't cry dramatically. It was a few tears, quickly covered, turned into something resembling a laugh, but he saw it. Of course he saw it. He was a man who watched her with an attentiveness that still surprised her after weeks of it, an attentiveness that was not possessive or intense, but simply present, the way strong light is present, illuminating everything without forcing anything. He didn't make a production of it. He didn't ask what was wrong or move to comfort her in a way that would have made her feel exposed. He just quietly refilled his own glass, and then after a moment, in the same ordinary tone, said that he had been thinking about her every day for 3 months, that he had been thinking about her since the first meeting, and had not stopped, and that he had never in his adult life thought about a person every day for 3 months, without telling them. Serena set down her fork. She looked at him across the candle-lit table in his apartment, this man in his blue jacket and his steady eyes, this man who had been patient with her in a way she had not asked him to be and had not expected, and could not now account for. And she felt the last of the structure she had built crack down the middle. She had built that structure over years. It had started with her first serious relationship, at 23, when she had loved someone who had loved the idea of her more than the actual person, and she had bent herself into shapes trying to match what he needed her to be, until she barely recognized herself. It had continued through a series of smaller relationships that had all ended the same way, with her having given more than she had been given, having stayed longer than was wise, having talked herself into things her instincts told her not to trust. By the time she was 32, she had arrived at a philosophy that felt like wisdom and functioned as protection. Keep it short, keep it defined, don't let roots form, and you will never lose yourself in someone else's version of who you should be. Marcus had not tried to override this philosophy. He had not argued with it or dismissed it. or attempted to convince her it was wrong. He had simply, steadily, been so entirely himself in her presence that her philosophy had nothing to push against. He had not asked her to be anything. He had simply been interested in what she already was, and there is no defense against that. There is no wall strong enough to keep out the person who is not attacking it, but simply sitting on the other side of it, being real, being consistent, being interested in you with an honesty that asks nothing in return. She said to him that night, with the pasta going cold between them, that she was frightened, not of him, of herself, of how much she had already let this become before she had consciously decided to let it. She told him that she had spent 8 years learning how not to need someone, and that she had gotten very good at it, and that somewhere in the last 3 months he had made the whole skill feel like a loss rather than an achievement. He listened to all of this the way he always listened, fully, without interrupting, without rushing toward a resolution. When she was finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said something that she would carry with her for the rest of her life. He said that he didn't want her to need him. He wanted her to choose him, every day, from a place of wholeness, not emptiness. He said there was nothing he wanted less than for her to be with him because she couldn't manage without him. What he wanted, and he said this with a plainness that made it devastating, was for her to be entirely complete without him, and then choose to be with him anyway. Not because she needed filling, because she wanted company. Serena Calvo, who had cross-examined witnesses in federal court without blinking, could not speak for a full 30 seconds after that. But life does not proceed in straight lines, even when the people in it have finally found the right words for each other. The weeks after that Wednesday dinner brought something that neither of them had anticipated, not doubt about each other, but pressure from the world around them that tested the fragile, still forming thing they were building. The first pressure was professional. A major client of Marcus's firm approached him with a proposal that would require him to move operations to another city for a period of no less than 18 months. It was the largest contract his firm had ever been offered. It was the kind of opportunity that 2 years earlier would have been an automatic yes, a pure professional calculation with no competing variables. Now it sat on his desk like a question he didn't know how to answer, because for the first time in his professional life, there was a competing variable. And she was a variable he had not finished choosing yet. He did not tell Serena about the offer immediately. He told himself he was waiting until he had thought it through, which was true, but it was also true that he was afraid that if he told her, she would say the thing she had always said, that they had never formally committed to anything, that she had always been clear about the limits, that this was exactly the kind of complication she had warned him about from the beginning. He was afraid that an 18-month absence would be the excuse she needed to do what part of her had always been prepared to do: step back, close the door, return to the life she had designed to need no one. He should have known better. He should have known that the thing that had drawn him to Serena was the very thing that made concealing something from her impossible. She was too observant, too precise in her reading of people, too accustomed to spotting the thing that wasn't being said. She noticed the shift in him within 4 days. She noticed it in the way he talked around the subject of his work, in the slight tightening around his eyes when she asked about the week ahead. And she asked him directly, in the way she did everything. What was going on? He told her. He told her all of it: the offer, the timeline, the size of the opportunity, the fact that he had been sitting on it because he was afraid of what it would mean for them. And she was quiet for a long time, the kind of quiet that has weight, that asks you to wait inside it without filling it with words. When she finally spoke, she did not say what he had feared. She did not retreat or close off, or recite the old logic about limits and boundaries. Instead, she said something that told him exactly how much had changed in the months they had been circling each other, and then falling, gradually and irrevocably, together. She said that she was not going to make this decision for him, and she was not going to pretend the offer wasn't significant, and she was not going to be the reason he walked away from something he had built his whole career toward. But she said that whatever he decided, she needed him to decide it, knowing that she was no longer neutral, that she was no longer someone who could call this undefined and mean it, that she had crossed somewhere in the last few months the border she had sworn never to cross, and she was standing on the other side of it, and she needed him to know that. Marcus looked at her for a long time. The room felt very still. Outside the windows, the city moved in its indifferent way, all noise and light and forward motion, paying no attention to the two people inside this room who were in the middle of something irreversible. He said, "Then I already have my answer." She said, "Don't decide because of me." He said, "I'm not deciding because of you. I'm deciding because of what I want my life to look like. And I know what I want it to look like. I've known since a woman in a yellow dress told me this was just one night, and I knew immediately that was not enough." She laughed at that, a real laugh, unguarded and warm, the laugh he had told her he noticed before she ever spoke. And he crossed the room and she met him halfway, which was the only way it could have ever worked between two people who had both spent too long crossing no distances at all. The months that followed were not without difficulty. Nothing worth having is ever without difficulty, and both Serena and Marcus were people who had been shaped by hard things, and who carried the marks of those shaping forces into everything they did. There were evenings when old fears surfaced in her, and she became distant without warning, retreating to the part of herself that had learned to function without anyone. And Marcus had to learn the difference between giving her space and abandoning the ground he had come to stand on. There were mornings when his old habits of emotional self-sufficiency made him close off when she needed him to be open, and she had to learn the patience to wait for him, rather than read his closure as rejection. They argued sometimes not cruelly, but honestly, with the particular sharpness of two intelligent people who have strong feelings and strong opinions and no practice in letting themselves be wrong. They had to learn how to be wrong in front of each other, which is possibly the most intimate thing two people can do. Not the big declarations or the grand gestures, but the small, humble act of saying, "I was wrong about this, and I can see that you were hurt by it, and I am sorry," without qualification. Serena threw herself into this learning with the same intensity she brought to everything. She was not a person who did things halfway. Once she had decided to stop guarding the territory and let something grow there, she tended it with a fierceness that sometimes surprised even Marcus, who had believed in this from the beginning. She brought herself into the relationship fully, her fears and her history and her opinions and her affection and her humor, and the particular, rare quality of her attention when she looked at you and you knew she was actually seeing you, not the version of you she needed you to be or feared you might become, but the actual, current, complicated, worthy you. And Marcus, who had spent 6 years in the waiting room of his own life, brought himself out of it slowly and then all at once. He turned down the long-term relocation offer, taking a shorter consulting arrangement instead that let him remain in the city. He did this not as a sacrifice but as a preference, which is a distinction that matters. He told his partners that his priorities had shifted, said it without apology, without the defensive explanation he would once have felt obligated to provide. He began, for the first time in his adult life, to let his schedule be interrupted by things that were not in it: phone calls that ran long, dinners that bled into walks, Saturdays in bookshops, Sunday mornings that weren't optimized for anything. He became, by degrees, a person who had room in his life for another person, not at the cost of himself. That was never the goal, but alongside himself, which is the only way it actually works. 1 year after they had stood on that street corner and she had said, "This is just one night," and he had said, "I want every night," they were sitting in the same restaurant where they'd had their first dinner. The candles were the same short kind. The wine was different. The window still looked out onto the lit street. And they were different people than the ones who had sat there the year before, or rather they were the same people but more fully arrived at themselves, less defended, more willing to be seen in the exact shape they were. Serena was talking about a case she was working on, something complicated and interesting, and Marcus was listening in the way he always listened. And she paused in the middle of a sentence and looked at him across the table and said something she had been carrying for a while. Something she wanted to say in the right place at the right time, and had decided this was it. She said that she had been wrong about the one night. Not about being careful, she still believed in being careful, still thought that people moved too fast into things they hadn't earned yet. But she had been wrong about this particular one night, about this particular man, about the calculation she had done that. Said connection was only safe when it was small and contained and had a clear exit. She said she was glad he had disagreed with her. She said that was probably the most important disagreement she had ever lost. Marcus reached across the table and took her hand. The city moved outside the window. The candles did what candles do. And he thought about all the versions of himself that had led to this specific moment, the 28-year-old who had decided that love was a liability, the 34-year-old in an elevator who had felt a window shade lift for a fraction of a second before being lowered again, the man on the street corner who had said something honest and then watched her walk away and felt something open rather than close. He thought about all the nights he had spent alone in rooms that were beautiful and quiet and perfectly ordered, and completely empty of the thing that makes a room feel like home, which is not furniture or design or any quality of light, but simply the presence of someone who has seen you in your least managed moments and stayed anyway. He thought about the one night she had offered him and the every night he had asked for, and how the distance between those two things had been, in the end, the most important journey of his life. He did not say any of this aloud. He just held her hand and she let him, which was, between two people who had both spent too long letting no one hold anything of theirs, entirely sufficient. If this story reached something in you, if you felt what it is to guard yourself so carefully that you almost missed the thing you were guarding yourself for, then please take a moment before you read the final lines. Drop a comment below telling me the one sentence from this story that stayed with you the most. Your comment might be the thing that makes someone else click play. And if this story moved you in any way, if you found something of yourself in Marcus or in Serena, please like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear that it is not too late to stop waiting and start choosing. There is a particular kind of courage that does not announce itself. It does not look like bravery from the outside. It looks, from the outside, like a person sitting across a candlelit table holding someone's hand, having made a series of small, quiet choices over many months that added up, without fanfare, to a life that was finally, genuinely, fully inhabited. Serena would tell you, if you asked her, and she was now the kind of person who could be asked such things, that she had not changed. She had not become someone different, had not abandoned her independence or her precision or her hard-won ability to stand alone in any room. She had simply added something to what she already was. She had let in one person, carefully and then completely, and the structure she had spent years building had not collapsed under the weight. It had held. It had turned out to be stronger for having someone inside it rather than weaker. Marcus would tell you that the best investment he had ever made was not in his firm or his portfolio or any of the measurable, optimizable things he had spent his professional life acquiring. It was in the 30 seconds on a street corner when he had told the truth about what he wanted to a woman who had every reason to walk away from it. He had not known in that moment whether she would ever come back. He had not known whether the wanting would be enough, but he had said it anyway because it was true. And because some truths need to be spoken aloud to become real, and because he had spent 6 years being too careful to be honest, and he was tired of the cost of that particular kind of safety. She had said it was just one night. He had said he wanted every night. And in the end, after everything, after the fear and the slow dismantling and the learning and the honest arguments and the ordinary dinners made wholly simply by being shared, she had given him exactly that. Every night. Every ordinary, irreplaceable, impossible to optimize, impossible to build a wall against night. Which was, it turned out, everything.